Yo, what's going on, guys? SMH Super Mario Hoops back with some more hoops, and today we're going to talk about the what if about the NBA Florida Finals. Now, before we get into this video, I'm going to need you guys to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and you'll see all the videos I post from here on out. But without further ado, let's get right into it. So this season, the 1990-1991 NBA season, the real NBA Finals for this year was the Chicago Bulls and the LA Lakers. It's most famously known as Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls' first championship. This is also Magic Johnson's last NBA Finals, and while the Lakers did win Game 1, the Bulls ended up winning the series in 5, and Michael Jordan was Finals MVP. So how does Florida get into the mix for this season? And that's just what we're going to get into. Going back to 1989-1990, the Miami Heat, who came into the league in 1988, and the Orlando Magic, who are now in their first season, were both in the Eastern Conference, whereas the Charlotte Hornets, who also came into the league in 1988, were in the Western Conference. Well, things would change in 1990-1991 as the expansion teams kind of had teams shifting conferences, trying to figure out which would be best for every team in the NBA. So in this season, the Miami Heat and the Charlotte Hornets were in the Eastern Conference, whereas the Orlando Magic were now in the West. Therefore, Charlotte and Orlando kind of flipped conferences. And this is kind of really weird because looking at some of the teams that were still in the East, I mean, Cleveland, you could debate maybe it's a little bit more Western than Orlando, but Milwaukee, Indiana, Detroit, and Chicago were more Western for sure. And it's really surprising that the Bucks weren't, because they were in the Western Conference until 1980 when the league added the Dallas Mavericks. But you think by now they'd make that adjustment. Just looking at the teams though, in 1990-1991, the Miami Heat in the Eastern Conference starting lineup has Sherman Douglas at the point, Billy Thompson at the shooting guard, Glenn Rice at small forward, probably the most prestigious player on this team. You also had Grant Long at power forward and Rony Seikaly at center, who really wasn't that bad. The bench consisted of solid players like Willie Burton and Kevin Edwards as well. But unfortunately, their record was 24-58, and actually this was a worse record than the year before. They actually lost 14 more games this season than the year prior. Moving on to the Orlando Magic for this season now in 1990-1991. Starting lineup was Scott Skiles at the point, Nick Anderson at the 2, and Dennis Scott at the 3, two players that they had when they made the finals a few years later. Power forward, they had Terry Catledge, and center was Greg Kite. The bench consisted of Otis Smith and Jerry Reynolds, all for a record of 31-51, which was actually the best in their franchise history up to this point. Now remember, this is before the Magic had guys such as Shaquille O'Neal or Penny Hardaway, so it kind of makes sense why they were so bad. But in the 1989-1990 season, they were actually the second and third worst records in the league, tied at 18-64. The third pick went to Miami, who ended up getting the selection of Chris Jackson, who went to Denver. This is also known as Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. The fourth pick was Orlando. That's how they got Dennis Scott. But just looking at what this could have done for the NBA if these two teams in this specific season were in the finals instead of the lottery, here's a few takeaways that I have. First of all, the Florida Finals would intensify a rivalry that has never really been there, because as we see it, both Miami and Orlando have had their glory days. I think Miami's had a little bit more, but they've never really been a true rivalry in NBA history. And it's kind of a shame because, you know, having two teams from the same state, obviously we see it in California. We're seeing it right now with the Lakers and the Clippers. You could even argue to an extent the Warriors are in that mix because they have some rivalry with each of those LA teams. But we haven't really seen that in Florida, and it's just kind of weird. The second thing is that it would have a Super Bowl-esque feeling where no team truly has home court advantage. Being that the teams are so close to each other in the same state, there's going to be a lot of fans from the other teams still coming to the games from each team. So if it's in Orlando, there's going to be Miami fans there. If it's in Miami, you'll still have some Orlando fans as guests as well. The third point that I have is it would be significant for history based on the 2020 finals and the bubble, which would make Florida the only state to be the host of every finals game in a series for not just 1 year, but 2, because as we remember, in the COVID season, they had it at Orlando in the Disney bubble, and that's where the Lakers won over the Miami Heat in 6 games in the finals. The fourth point that I have is that being that the finals would be in Florida in a regular basketball setting and without controversial moments displayed in the bubble, such as how the bubble handled the BLM situation, instead of being one of the worst rated finals like 2020, it would probably be one of the best. Now, granted, I think a lot of this has to do with the time that we're currently living in as opposed to back then, but my main point still stands. Guys like Scott Skiles, Nick Anderson, Dennis Scott, Glenn Rice, and Rony Seikaly were either all top players in the league or must-see TV to an extent. Especially being in a big market like Orlando or Miami, I think that it could be one of the highest rated finals that we would have had. The fifth point that I have is that if they were both top-tier contenders in the NBA, then a team like Orlando would essentially never get the chance to draft these players that we mentioned earlier, such as Shaquille O'Neal or Penny Hardaway. It would also mean that the Miami Heat would be less inclined to deal their core players in exchange for some of their greatest players in franchise history. This could include Alonzo Mourning and Tim Hardaway. And the sixth point that I have is that assuming the Bulls don't make the finals and beat Detroit in the fashion that they did, could this impact how we view the Bulls dynasty, MJ's legacy, and could it impact the decision on the Pistons to start breaking up core pieces of the team following this sweep? And the seventh big point that I have is that we would likely get to see a Magic Johnson versus Orlando Magic series prior to the finals, which is pretty hype if you ask me. I mean, Magic versus Magic, I don't know. It might be a little corny, but I thought it was cool. But I think that the moral of the story is that even though both of these teams were clearly terrible this year, if that wasn't the case, if we could just pretend and say that this wasn't the case for this season, I think it would create a lot for the NBA. It would create a lot for marketing. It would create a lot for merchandise. It would create a big rivalry. And looking around the NBA today, I don't think there's enough rivalries, especially since eventually these teams will probably be put in the same division. So there's a good chance that they'd be playing 3 or 4 times every season, and then every single game would count. Every single game would matter a lot. And also, every rebuild and major decision in the NBA is based in a timeline format for each team. So maybe this affects the Orlando Magic later on to never getting players such as Tracy McGrady or Grant Hill. Or maybe it ends up making them more likely to bring in a guy like Tim Duncan in 2000 free agency, where he nearly did in real life until they told him he can't bring family members on the plane because there's a championship culture in Orlando with this front office. Other players such as Dwight Howard or Hedo Turkoglu, maybe they don't end up coming to the Orlando Magic as a result. On the other side of things, maybe the Miami Heat never get the chance to draft their all-time greatest player in Dwayne Wade. And if that's the case, they likely don't bring in LeBron and Bosh in 2010. But maybe if they still want to form the Big Three, or at least the Big Two with LeBron and Wade, they do end up going somewhere like Chicago or New York, which was frequently mentioned as a possible destination in 2010. Maybe Pat Riley will step down much earlier before working to bring Jimmy Butler to Miami in that big 4-team trade during the free agency time. But I don't know. You guys can let me know what you think about this. I think that, yeah, obviously it wasn't likely to happen because both the Heat and the Magic, I mean, at minimum, they were 20 games under 500 or more for this season. So it's not really that likely, but it is pretty interesting, you got to admit. I think it's pretty cool to think about, especially since we did have, a finals in Florida just last year. So there's no other place that's really had a finals hosted just one state. So with that being the case for 2 different years, I think that that's pretty cool, to be honest. Especially since in this case, the fans would actually be there. And I think this year, more than any other year, has proved the fans' worth. But I mean, yeah, there's just so many possibilities that can be made simply off of a single different season because of one small adjustment and how it changed free agency, the draft, retirements, coaching changes, and so on. And as expected, the Orlando Magic and the Miami Heat were put back in the same conference the next season, and it's been that way since. So I don't think we'll ever see something like this again. It just seemed like a weird time for the NBA because they were adding so many teams. I also didn't mention they added the Minnesota Timberwolves around this time as well, so there were a lot of teams getting added into the NBA that they had to shake up all the new teams until they found the right spot for them. But I think that's pretty much going to do it for me. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, be sure to like, comment, subscribe. I did warn you at the beginning to subscribe, but if you haven't already, then maybe you should, and maybe you should hit that notification bell. And one last thing is also try to share the video. Every share matters to me. Appreciate it a lot. I don't think I have anything else to add. Thanks for watching, and I'm out. Peace.